I visited my son unannounced and discovered him in the hospital, facing a battle for his strength all on his own, a moment that shifted everything I believed about where I stood in his life. What I thought would be a simple visit turned into the beginning of a journey filled with revelation and choices that changed us both, and what happened next is something you will not want to miss. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. The sight of my son lying there pale and still, his chest rising with effort, the machines humming around him, left me frozen at the door for what felt like an eternity, and in those few seconds, memories crashed over me. Memories of holding him as a baby, of cheering him at school, of watching him grow into a man I thought was strong enough to face the world without me. And yet here he was, alone, fragile, and hidden away as though forgotten. My steps were slow as I moved toward his bed, my hand trembling as I reached for his arm, and I whispered his name softly, almost afraid that my voice would disturb the fragile thread that kept him tethered to life. And when his eyelids fluttered at the sound, a surge of both relief and anguish filled me. I asked myself why no one was there, where his wife was, where the family he had built around himself had gone, and the emptiness of that room answered before he could, because the absence of visitors, the untouched flowers at the nurse's desk, the quiet pity in the eyes of the staff I passed on the way in, all told the story before I was ready to hear it. For years I had told myself that my son no longer needed me, that distance was natural, that his silence was only the mark of a man busy with his own life. And yet standing there I realized how wrong I had been. Because when life struck hardest, he had been left without anyone by his side, left to fight battles that should never have been fought alone. My heart ached as I thought of all the sacrifices that had built his path, all the long nights and early mornings I had endured to make sure he had what he needed. And though I had tried to convince myself that my work was done when he married and moved away, in that hospital room it became clear that my role as his father was not finished, that perhaps it had only just begun again. The steady beeping of the monitors seemed to echo with every question swirling in my mind, questions about how he ended up there, about why the people he trusted most were nowhere to be found, questions that grew heavier with every second I stood by his bed, but in my heart I knew that the answers would come, and that when they did, they would demand more of me than I had ever expected. I brushed his hair gently from his forehead, my voice breaking as I told him that I was there now, that he was not alone anymore. And though his lips moved weakly, though his words barely reached me, I heard enough to know that this story was only beginning, and that the road ahead would test both of us in ways neither of us could have imagined. In the days before I made the decision to visit my son unannounced, I remember feeling a quiet anticipation that filled me with both eagerness and unease, because it had been far too long since I had last seen him, and though the distance between us had grown, a father's heart always holds hope that one more visit, one more conversation, might bridge the gap that time and circumstance had created, and so I prepared myself for a journey I thought would be simple, unaware of the storm waiting for me at its end. I woke that morning with the kind of resolve that comes from love, telling myself that I did not need an invitation to see my own son, that I did not need to wait for a call that might never come, and that perhaps, by surprising him, I could remind him that I was still here, still the father who had carried him through his childhood, still the man who had sacrificed so much to give him every chance at life. As I packed a small bag with clothes and a few things I thought he might need, I found myself smiling at the memories that rose unbidden, the sound of his laughter when he was young, the pride in his eyes, when he showed me his school projects, the warmth of his hugs, that once felt like they could mend anything. And I told myself that even if our relationship had cooled with time, Those memories were proof that the bond between father and son could never truly be broken. The drive itself became a journey of reflection, mile after mile carrying me deeper into thoughts of what I might find when I arrived. And though doubt whispered that he might not welcome my surprise, I silenced it with the conviction that love never needs permission, love simply acts, and I clung to that belief as the road stretched ahead of me. I imagined the moment I would knock on his door, the look of surprise on his face when he saw me, the way his voice would catch with emotion as he realized I had come all that way just to see him. And I pictured us sitting together at his kitchen table, sharing a meal and perhaps a laugh, talking through the silence that had too long filled the space between us. Anticipation grew stronger with every passing mile, and though my hands tightened around the steering wheel with nerves, my heart was light with hope. Because I believed that this visit would be the beginning of something new, a chance to heal the distance that had crept between us. I thought of how his life must have changed, how his marriage and responsibilities had filled his days, and I told myself that it was only natural for him to drift away, that he had not meant to shut me out, that he had simply been overwhelmed, and I promised myself that I would not scold him for the silence, but simply be present, simply show him that no matter what, his father was still by his side. As the city skyline gave way to quieter streets, as I drew closer to where he lived, I felt a swell of pride and nervous joy, rehearsing the words I might say, words of encouragement, words of love, words that reminded him that he was not alone in the world even if he felt that way sometimes. My anticipation was not grand, it was simple. The anticipation of a father who wanted only to see his child, to share a moment that could not be measured in gifts or money, but in the quiet power of presence. And as I turned down the last road leading toward his home, I felt my heart race with the belief that what awaited me would be nothing more than the comfort of reunion. I could not know then that the anticipation I carried so carefully would soon collapse into shock, that the surprise I thought would bring joy would instead lead me into the most heartbreaking discovery of my life. But in that moment, the only thing I carried was hope, fragile and powerful, guiding me to his door. When I think about the years that led me to that hospital room where I found my son alone fighting for his life, I cannot separate the image of him lying weak and fragile from the countless sacrifices that had carried us both to that point. Because being his father was never a task I took lightly. It was a promise I made the moment I first held him in my arms. And that promise shaped every choice, every hardship, and every victory that marked our lives together. When his mother passed far too soon, leaving me with the weight of raising him on my own, I made a vow that he would never feel the emptiness that loss could carve into a child's heart. And so I worked harder than I thought possible, pushing through exhaustion and loneliness to ensure he had not only what he needed, but what would help him thrive. There were nights when I came home from long shifts, my back aching and my hands raw, only to find him asleep with his school books scattered across the table, and instead of collapsing into bed, I would gently move his papers aside, kiss his forehead, and remind myself that every sacrifice was worth it if it meant he could dream freely without the weight of worry. I took jobs others turned away from, jobs that drained the strength from my body, because those jobs paid for his education, for his meals, for the small joys that made his childhood brighter. And though I often went without, I never let him see the cost, because I wanted him to believe that life, even in hardship, could still be filled with possibility. I remember the winters when I patched my old coat year after year so that he could have a new one, the summers when I worked under the blazing sun so that he could join sports teams or buy books that inspired him, And I remember how his smile, wide and unguarded, always made the sacrifices feel like blessings rather than burdens. There were times when bills piled up and I did not know how I would cover them, but somehow I always found a way, selling the few possessions I had left from my youth or taking on extra shifts that left me weary, because my son's future mattered more than my comfort. And I carried that truth like a shield through every storm. When he reached the age to dream of college, I knew the cost would be great, but I never hesitated, draining my savings, taking on debts, and working hours that left me breathless, because I wanted him to walk across that stage with pride, holding a diploma that symbolized not just his hard work, but the sacrifices that had made it possible. I still remember the day he graduated, the sun shining down on his cap and gown, the way his eyes searched the crowd until they found me, and the way my chest swelled with pride, knowing that every late night, every ache, every quiet moment of doubt had been worth it. Even after he moved into adulthood, after he began to build a life of his own, I continued to support him in ways large and small, slipping him money when I saw him struggling, paying off small debts without telling him, offering guidance even when he seemed too busy to listen, because a father's role does not end when a child grows, it only changes. My years of sacrifice were not just about money or labor, they were about presence, about showing him that no matter how hard the world pressed down, he would never face it alone. And that knowledge carried me forward, even when loneliness gnawed at me after his marriage distanced him from me. Now, sitting by his hospital bed, hearing the hum of machines keeping him alive, I felt the weight of those years settle over me, not as regret, but as a reminder that every sacrifice had always been made with love, and that love would now demand of me something even greater, because the years of sacrifice had prepared me not just to provide, but to fight for him when he could no longer fight for himself. As I sat in that hospital room, watching my son struggle for every breath, my mind drifted back to the years when the distance between us first began to show itself. And though I had always told myself it was natural for children to grow, to build their own lives, to stand on their own 2 feet, I could not deny that something heavier lingered beneath the silence that had grown wider with each passing year. In the early days after he married, he would still call from time to time, his voice filled with the same warmth I had known since he was a boy. And I clung to those calls as proof that no matter what else changed, our bond would remain. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the calls grew shorter, the visits fewer, until one day I realized entire months had slipped by without hearing from him at all. At first, I blamed myself, wondering if I had done something to push him away, if perhaps my advice had sounded like criticism, or if my presence had become a reminder of a past he wanted to move beyond. Then I thought perhaps it was his new life, the demands of work, the pressure of maintaining a home, the responsibilities of marriage, and I tried to silence the ache in my chest with reason, convincing myself that busyness was not the same as neglect. Yet deep down, I felt the change in ways that logic could not soothe, because the boy who once shared every dream and fear with me now shared nothing at all. And the man who had promised that no matter where life took him, he would never forget where he came from, began to act as though our history were an old book collecting dust on a forgotten shelf. There were holidays when I set the table for 2, hoping he might surprise me, only to sit alone with food growing cold while the clock ticked away the hours. There were birthdays when I waited by the phone, each ring filling me with hope, only to realize by nightfall that the silence would not break. Each absence cut deeper than the one before, not because I craved attention, but because I craved connection, the assurance that the sacrifices I had made had not been buried under the weight of his new life. I tried to bridge the distance myself, driving to his home unannounced a few times, only to be met with excuses about busy schedules, about plans that could not be changed, about promises to visit soon that rarely came true. His wife often stood in the doorway with polite smiles that never reached her eyes, her tone courteous but clipped, as though my presence was an interruption rather than a welcome. And each time I drove back home, I carried with me a heaviness that no amount of reasoning could lift. I told myself over and over that he still loved me, that the distance was only temporary, that life had a way of pulling people apart before bringing them back together. But in the quiet hours of the night, I could not escape the truth that I was losing him, not in body, but in spirit. The distance grew like a shadow, stretching across every part of our bond, and though I tried to hold on, I felt my grip slipping no matter how tightly I clenched my fists. Even then, despite the ache, I never stopped loving him, never stopped hoping that one day he would walk through my door again with the same smile he had as a child, never stopped believing that the silence would eventually break. But, sitting in that hospital room, seeing him so fragile and alone, I realized that the distance had been more than a natural drift. It had been a warning, a sign that something was deeply wrong, a sign I had ignored because I was too afraid to face what it truly meant. The day I decided to visit my son unannounced began with simple hope in my heart, a hope that I would find him at home, that he would greet me with surprise and perhaps relief, that we could sit together and bridge the distance that had grown too wide. But when I arrived at his house and stood at the door, knocking again and again, only to be met with silence, I felt the first chill of unease settle into my bones. The yard was unkempt, weeds creeping through cracks in the pavement, the mailbox stuffed with envelopes that had clearly not been collected in days, and the windows stood dark despite the late afternoon sun. I tried the knob, called his name, pressed my ear to the door, but there was nothing, only the hollow stillness of a place abandoned. My heart quickened as I walked around the house, hoping he might appear at the back door, that perhaps he had simply stepped out for groceries. But the longer I searched, the clearer it became that something was terribly wrong. A neighbor across the street noticed me and called out, her voice hesitant. And when I crossed over to her driveway, she looked at me with a pity that made my chest tighten. She asked if I was his father, and when I nodded, she shook her head slowly and said she had been meaning to reach out, that she was worried that he had been taken away by ambulance days ago, and no one had returned since. The words struck me harder than any blow, leaving me momentarily speechless, and when I finally asked where, she told me the name of the hospital, her voice low and uncertain, as though she feared she had already said too much. I thanked her, my throat tight, and hurried back to my car, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel, the cold reality pressing harder with each turn of the engine. My son had been in the hospital all this time, and I had not known. No call, no message, no word from anyone. And as the miles stretched between his empty house and the hospital doors, I felt a sorrow heavier than I had ever carried before, a sorrow that whispered of betrayal, abandonment, and a truth I was not ready to face. When I finally pulled into the parking lot, the building loomed before me, stark and unwelcoming, and as I walked through the sliding glass doors, the smell of antiseptic filled my lungs, sharp and unforgiving. I made my way to the reception desk, my voice unsteady as I gave his name, and the nurse's glance at her screen, followed by the faint shadow that passed over her face, told me more than her polite tone could. She directed me to a floor high above, and as I rode the elevator up, I stared at my reflection in the metal doors, an old man's face staring back at me, lined with years of sacrifice, hope, and worry, now twisted by fear of what I was about to find. The doors opened with a chime that seemed cruel in its cheer, and as I stepped into the hallway lined with closed rooms, each one humming with machines, I felt my breath catch. The cold reality of his absence from his home had been shocking enough, but as I reached his door and placed my hand on the handle, I knew that whatever waited beyond it would change everything. For the emptiness of his house, the neighbor's words, and the nurse's glance had already told me the truth. My son was fighting for his life, and he was doing it without anyone by his side. When I finally opened the door to his hospital room, the sight that met me froze me where I stood, because nothing in all my years of sacrifice, nothing in the long road of fatherhood, had prepared me for the image of my son lying so still, his skin pale, his lips dry, his chest rising only with the help of machines that beeped and hummed in an endless rhythm, each sound a reminder of how fragile his grasp on life had become, and the shock of it pressed against me with a weight that nearly brought me to my knees. I had imagined many things on my way there. Imagined perhaps he would be sitting up reading. Imagined I would see him smile weakly when he noticed me. Imagined I would be able to hold his hand and tell him I was there before the full force of his suffering struck me. But none of those hopes matched the reality that now stood before me, a reality in which my son was fighting alone in a bed that seemed too large for his fragile frame. The room was quiet except for the machines, the blinds half drawn, a single glass of water untouched on the table beside him, and I knew at once that no one else had been there for him. No flowers brightened the room, no cards lined the window ledge, no familiar belongings rested by his side, only the cold sterility of a place that had become his world in my absence. I stepped slowly toward him, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his arm, and when my fingers brushed his skin it was cold, a chill that pierced me deeper than any winter, because I remembered the warmth of his hand as a boy, small and eager, tugging at me with trust. And now, here I was, a father watching that same hand lie motionless against the sheets. I whispered his name softly, my voice cracking under the weight of everything I felt, and for a moment I thought he would not respond. But then his eyelids fluttered faintly, his lips moving as though he were trying to form words, and the sight of that small effort filled me with a mixture of hope and anguish. I bent closer, straining to hear him, and though his words were broken, faint, and weak, I caught enough to know that he had been here alone, that no one had sat by his side, that the people he had once trusted most had not even bothered to come. The shock of seeing him like this cut deeper with every second, because I could not reconcile the man before me with the boy I had raised, the boy whose laughter once filled my home, the boy whose strength I had believed unshakable. The monitors kept up their rhythm, steady but haunting, and as I sat in the chair beside his bed, I felt the enormity of the situation sink into my bones. I should have been there sooner, I told myself. I should never have let the distance grow. I should never have allowed silence to replace conversation. But those thoughts only deepened the ache in my chest, and so I focused instead on the fact that I was there now, that no matter how alone he had been, he would not be alone anymore. My eyes moved around the room again, taking in the stark absence of love, the emptiness of the space where care should have been, and I promised myself quietly that I would fill it, that I would be the presence he needed, that I would not leave him to face this fight without someone at his side. The shocking scene of my son lying there, fighting for his life in solitude, was the hardest thing I had ever witnessed. but it was also the moment that ignited a fire within me, a determination that no matter what truth I uncovered about how he ended up here, no matter who had abandoned him, I would not allow this image to be the final chapter of his story. As I sat by my son's bedside, holding his cold hand in mine and listening to the steady rhythm of the machines that kept him tethered to life, I could not help but let my ears wander beyond the walls of his room, because, in a hospital, silence is never complete, and the voices of nurses and staff drift through the corridors carrying truths that patients themselves are sometimes too weak or too proud to share. And what I overheard in those hushed conversations cut through me more deeply than the sight of my son lying there alone. I had stepped out briefly to get some water, my mind heavy with questions about how he had ended up in such a state. And as I stood near the nurses' station, I heard two of them speaking softly. Their words not meant for me, but impossible to ignore. One nurse sighed and said it was heartbreaking that such a young man had been here for weeks without a single visitor, that not once had family or friends come to sit by his side, and that his condition seemed to worsen not only from illness, but from the weight of that loneliness. Another nurse added that the bills were piling up, that he had fallen behind on payments, and that without someone stepping in, soon the situation could turn desperate, because while the hospital would not abandon him, the financial strain was becoming impossible to hide. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, because their words painted a picture even darker than the one I had already seen with my own eyes. And I realized that not only had my son been fighting for his life alone, he had been fighting against a tide of debt and abandonment that no one had bothered to help him face. I returned to his room with the weight of their conversation pressing hard against me, and as I looked at him lying there pale and fragile, I asked myself who had failed him, who had turned away, and why no one had thought to call me. Why I had to discover all of this only because I decided to visit unannounced. The shock of the nurse's words deepened when I overheard another fragment later that evening, when a different nurse told a colleague that his wife had not been seen in weeks, that she had signed papers leaving all responsibility in his name before disappearing, and that staff had whispered among themselves about how cruel it was to watch someone so vulnerable left behind. I sat in the chair beside his bed, my fists tightening around the arms as those words echoed in my mind, and I looked at my son, remembering the pride in his eyes when he told me years ago that he had found the woman he wanted to spend his life with, remembering how he had defended her even when I sensed something cold behind her smile, and I wondered if those warnings I had buried had been right all along. The sound of the monitors filled the silence between us, steady but heavy, and I felt the weight of both sorrow and anger rising in me, because the thought of him lying here abandoned while debts mounted and his wife vanished cut deeper than any insult or betrayal I had endured in my own life. The conversations I overheard were not meant for me, but they became the turning point of my understanding, the moment when the pieces began to fall into place, and though I had yet to hear the truth from his lips, I knew with certainty that my son had been left to fight alone, not only against sickness, but against the cold absence of those who should have been his strength. I looked at him again, his chest rising with effort, his hand weak in mine, and I whispered a promise into the dim light of that room, a promise that I would uncover every truth, that I would not let the cruelty of abandonment go unanswered, that I would be the presence he had been denied, because the conversations I had overheard had opened my eyes to a reality that could no longer be ignored. As I sat by my son's bedside, the quiet rhythm of the machines filling the air, I knew that sooner or later he would have to speak, that no matter how weak his body seemed, The truth resting inside him would find its way to the surface, and when it finally came, it was not with strength, but with the fragile weight of words whispered through dry lips, words that carried more pain than even his illness could inflict, because in those trembling moments he confessed to me the truth of how he had ended up here alone. His eyes opened slowly, clouded with exhaustion, yet desperate for release. And when he saw me sitting there, his lips curved faintly as though he wanted to believe my presence was not a dream, and with what little energy he could gather, he told me that his wife had left him. At first I thought I had misheard, that my own mind had twisted his weak voice into something darker than he meant. But as he repeated himself, I felt my heart crack, because his words painted a picture of abandonment so cruel that even the warnings I had once carried did not prepare me for it. He told me she had drained his savings, that she had left when his sickness began, that she had signed papers pushing all responsibility for the mounting bills onto him, and that in the days when he needed her most, she had chosen to walk away into a life more comfortable, leaving him with nothing but the crushing weight of debt and the silence of an empty room. His voice faltered often, broken by coughs and the effort it took to form each sentence, but I did not interrupt. I only held his hand tighter, urging him to release every word he had buried inside, because I knew that keeping his pain hidden had been as heavy as the illness that weakened his body. He spoke of the nights he lay awake, listening to the machines, waiting for her to return, convincing himself that she had only needed time, that she would come back, only to realize with each passing day that he had been left behind completely. He admitted he had been too ashamed to call me, too proud to confess, that the woman he had defended against my doubts had proved me right, and his tears slipped slowly down his cheeks as he whispered that he had not wanted me to see him like this, broken in body and betrayed in spirit. Hearing those words tore at me, not because I needed the validation of being right, but because no father wants his child to suffer alone. No father wants his son to believe that shame could ever outweigh love. And I told him through my own tears that there was nothing he could say that would lessen my presence, nothing he could confess that would drive me away. His confession was not only about her betrayal, it was about his own heart, his regret for pushing me aside, his guilt for choosing silence over honesty, and I listened with patience because I knew this was not the time to remind him of the warnings I had once given. It was the time to assure him that he was not alone anymore. The weight of his words settled over me like a shadow, yet within that shadow was also a clarity I had not felt before, a clarity that told me his suffering would not go unanswered, that her betrayal would not stand unchallenged, and that the bond between us, though scarred by silence, was still alive, still strong enough to carry him through what lay ahead. His confession was the spark that lit my resolve, for in those broken sentences I saw the truth I had been searching for, the truth that demanded action. And as I pressed his hand gently and promised him that I would take care of everything, I felt a fire rising in me, the fire of a father who had been patient for too long, the fire of a man who knew that the time for silence was over. After my son's confession settled into the silence of that hospital room, I sat there with his weak hand in mine, and my mind spiraled into an inner monologue so loud that it drowned out even the steady beeping of the monitors, because every word he had spoken echoed against the walls of my memory, forcing me to confront not only the cruelty of what had been done to him, but also the choices I had made that led us here. I thought back to the first time I met the woman he married, the way her smile never reached her eyes, the way she treated me as though my years of sacrifice had no value, and I remembered the unease that had crawled into my chest. Unease I swallowed down because I did not want to risk driving a wedge between us. I told myself that love was his choice, that he had to build his own life, and that my role as his father was to support him even if my instincts screamed warnings I could not quiet. But now, sitting by his side, I wondered if my silence had been a mistake, if my attempts at patience had been a form of surrender that allowed her cruelty to grow unchecked. My mind replayed the years of sacrifice, the nights of labor, the countless times I gave without question, and I asked myself how those sacrifices could lead to this moment where he lay frail and alone, abandoned by the one person he trusted most. Anger flared within me. Anger at her for leaving him, anger at myself for staying silent, anger at the world for allowing such betrayal to go unpunished. Yet beneath that anger was a grief so profound it nearly broke me, because all I ever wanted was for my son to live a life free from the hardships I had endured. And now I watched him bear a weight heavier than anything I had ever carried. My inner voice grew sharper, demanding to know why I had allowed myself to be pushed aside, why I had accepted the distance that grew between us, why I had convinced myself that his silence was simply the mark of independence rather than a cry for help. I thought of the countless times I had waited by the phone for his call, the holidays I spent alone, the visits I made that were met with excuses, and I realized that I had allowed my fear of losing him to stop me from speaking the truth, and in doing so, I had lost him anyway, not to distance, but to betrayal. As I sat there, the monologue inside me shifted from questions to resolve, from grief to determination, because I understood that dwelling on the past would not change what had already been done. But what I did now could change what came next. I told myself that my son would not fight alone anymore, that the woman who abandoned him would not walk away untouched, that those who mocked his pain would not continue to live as though their actions carried no consequence. My thoughts sharpened into a plan, vague yet forming, a sense that I had to act not only for him, but for the years of sacrifice that had built the life she so carelessly discarded. I whispered silently to myself that I was not the weak old man she believed me to be, that my love for my son was not a weakness but a strength, and that the years of silence that had once defined me would now become the foundation of my resolve. In that monologue, I saw clearly for the first time that dignity must be defended, that sacrifice must be honored, and that love, though quiet, can transform into fire when tested. And as I looked at my son's fragile form, I promised him silently that my thoughts would not remain thoughts for long, that every memory, every sacrifice, every ounce of strength I had left would be poured into making sure he would never again be left to fight alone. As I sat beside my son, replaying his confession in my mind, I could not stop the flood of memories that came back to me, memories of all the warnings I had carried quietly in my heart, warnings I had buried for the sake of keeping peace, warnings I wished I had spoken louder, even if it meant risking his anger. Because now, in the stillness of that hospital room, those warnings echoed like ghosts that would not let me rest. I remembered the first time he introduced her to me, the way she shook my hand with a grip that was more performance than sincerity, her smile polished but empty, her eyes scanning the room as though she were already measuring what she could gain from being part of our family. I remembered how she dismissed the stories I tried to share, the small anecdotes of his childhood that every father treasures, brushing them off as though they were inconveniences rather than pieces of the man she claimed to love. I remembered family dinners where she hardly looked my way, choosing instead to monopolize his attention with whispers and glances that carried no warmth for me. And though I felt the sting of being pushed aside, I swallowed my pride and told myself it was normal, that young couples carve out their own world, that I had to step back if I wanted him to be happy. But beneath that rationalization, my instincts churned, warning me that her arrogance was not a phase but a foundation, that her indifference toward me would one day extend to him, and still I kept silent. I remembered how she would question every gift I gave, every gesture I made, as though my love for him were a threat to her control, and how he, blinded by devotion, defended her with a fierceness that left me speechless, telling me that I was imagining things, that I was too protective, that I needed to trust him. And so I trusted, not because I believed she was worthy, but because I believed in him, because I thought that love had to be allowed to stand or fall on its own. I remembered the day she looked at me with that cold, dismissive glance when I offered advice about finances, her lips curving in a polite smile while her eyes revealed disdain. And I felt in my bones that she would never value the sacrifices I had made, that she saw me not as family, but as an obstacle to her ambitions. Still, I bit my tongue, telling myself that silence was better than discord, that my son would see in time what I already knew, and that speaking too soon would only drive him further from me. Yet, as I sat by his bed, listening to the machines breathe for him, I realized that my silence had not protected him. It had only allowed her to tighten her hold until the day she abandoned him completely. The memory of those warnings haunted me, not because I had been wrong, but because I had been right. And being right in hindsight is a curse heavier than being wrong, for it means the truth was always there and I lacked the courage to force it into the light. I thought of how many times I replayed conversations in my head after leaving their house, conversations where I wanted to tell him that love should never feel like dismissal, that respect is the foundation of every bond, that no marriage built on arrogance could endure. But each time I silenced myself, convincing myself that patience was love, and now that patience had led him here, broken and betrayed. As I looked at his frail body, I told myself that the time for silence was over, that every warning I had once buried would now become the foundation of my resolve, because I could not change the past, but I could shape what came next, and I would not allow the arrogance I had once endured to remain unchallenged. As the days passed, and I remained by my son's side in that hospital room, the staff, moved perhaps by the sight of an old man keeping vigil without pause, began to share details with me that deepened my understanding of what had been done to him, and each revelation carved deeper into my heart until I felt the weight of betrayal so heavy it nearly suffocated me. Because it was not just that his wife had abandoned him, it was how deliberately she had done it, leaving him to shoulder not only illness, but the crushing burden of financial ruin and emotional isolation. A nurse told me gently that his wife had been present only once, and that brief visit had not been marked by tenderness or worry, but by paperwork. Papers she insisted he sign while his hands shook from fever, documents transferring full responsibility for his medical bills into his name, leaving her shielded from any obligation while he bore the entire weight. Another staff member confided that she had not once called to ask about his condition since that day, not once sent flowers, not once shown the slightest interest in whether he lived or died. And as I listened to those words, I felt my chest tighten with rage, so fierce I could barely contain it, because betrayal by neglect is painful, but betrayal by calculated cruelty is unbearable. I thought back to all the years I had provided for him, the sacrifices that had built the foundation of his life, the quiet pride I had felt when he believed he had found love. And now, To see that love exposed as nothing more than selfish ambition made me tremble with a mixture of fury and sorrow. The depth of betrayal was not only in what she had taken from him financially, though that alone was staggering. It was in the way she had stripped him of dignity, leaving him to fight alone as though his life carried no value beyond the convenience he once offered her. I could see it in his eyes, even as he lay weak, the shame that lingered not because of what he had done, but because of what had been done to him. The shame of realizing too late that he had defended someone unworthy. The shame of understanding that the father he had dismissed had seen the truth all along. Yet even as my heart ached for him, my anger burned brighter against her, because no illness, no struggle, no difficulty justifies walking away from a spouse in their darkest hour. And she had not only walked away, she had pushed him deeper into despair before doing so. I sat in that chair, my hands gripping the armrests, and I told myself again and again that this betrayal would not stand, that every signature she had taken from him under duress, every dollar she had stolen, every ounce of dignity she had stripped would be answered. The depth of betrayal reached beyond her alone, for I realized how many others must have turned away. Friends who never visited, relatives who never checked in, a community that let him slip into this silence. And though I could not change their choices, I could promise myself that I would not join them in abandonment. Each night as I looked at him, sleeping fitfully beneath the soft hum of the machines, I whispered to him that I was there, that I would not leave, that no betrayal could erase the bond between father and son, and that one day soon justice would come for those who had left him in this state. Betrayal had cut him down, but it had also lit a fire in me, a fire that grew hotter with every revelation, and I knew with certainty that the depth of what she had done would become the depth of her downfall. That night, as I sat by my son's side, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and watching the rise and fall of his fragile chest, I felt something inside me harden into resolve, a quiet but unshakable strength that told me I could no longer stand as a passive witness to the cruelty he had endured, because the depth of betrayal I had uncovered demanded more than sorrow. It demanded action. I looked at his weakened body, the pale lines of his face, the IV in his arm, and I knew that though he was fighting with every ounce of strength left in him, he could not fight this battle alone. Not against illness, not against abandonment, not against the weight of debts that had been forced upon him with a signature taken in his weakest hour. My resolve was born not from anger alone, but from love, from the years of sacrifice that had defined our bond, from the memory of the boy he once was, clutching my hand with trust that I would never let go. And I promised myself silently that I would prove that trust was never misplaced. I resolved that he would not be left alone another day, that I would stand by his side in every way, feeding him strength where his own had been drained. And I resolved, too, that the woman who had abandoned him would face the truth she thought she could escape, because love betrayed must be answered by justice. As I sat there, I began to imagine the steps I would take, my mind sharpening like a blade honed by grief and devotion, and though I had no precise plan yet, I knew I would seek answers. I would follow the trail she had left behind. I would uncover the life she now lived while he suffered, and when I found her, she would have to confront not only me, but the evidence of what she had done. My resolve was not reckless. It was measured, built on the knowledge that patience had once been my downfall, and that this time I would act with the same care I had used to build a life for my son, slow but steady, deliberate but unstoppable. I whispered to him as he stirred in his sleep, telling him that he was not abandoned, that his father was here, that the world had not turned its back completely, and though he was too weak to respond, I felt the faint pressure of his fingers in mine, a silent acknowledgement that he heard me, that he knew. That small gesture only strengthened my resolve further, because it told me he still carried faith, faint but alive, and I could not let it be extinguished. I thought of his wife's arrogance, the way she had signed away responsibility, the way she had disappeared without so much as a word, and I told myself that one day soon she would be forced to stand in the light of truth. Her actions revealed to those who once thought her loyal, her selfishness laid bare. My resolve was not for revenge alone, but for dignity, for the dignity of my son who had been reduced to silence, for the dignity of a father who had been dismissed, for the dignity of a bond that had been tested but not broken. As the hours passed and the night grew deeper, I sat straighter in my chair, no longer weighed down by grief, but lifted by determination, and I knew that when the sun rose it would find me not as a man defeated, but as a man prepared, prepared to fight in every way I could, prepared to seek justice, prepared to protect what remained of my son's hope. Resolve is a quiet thing. It does not roar, it does not boast, but it anchors itself deep, and as I looked at my son's sleeping face, I felt that anchor settle in me, unmovable, unshakable, ready to carry us both through the storm that lay ahead. The morning after my resolve had solidified, I rose from the stiff chair beside my son's bed and knew that if I was to protect him fully, I would need more than determination. I would need counsel, the kind of guidance that could turn my love and my anger into action, that carried weight in the eyes of the law. And so while he slept, I slipped quietly from the hospital and made my way to the office of a lawyer I had trusted for many years, a man who had guided me through smaller matters, but who I knew could help me shape a plan for something far larger. As I entered his office, the familiar smell of leather and paper greeted me, the shelves lined with volumes of cases and statutes that represented the silent power of preparation. And when he saw me walk in, he rose from his chair with the steady warmth of a professional who never rushed to judgment. I sat across from him and laid out everything I had witnessed, from the shocking discovery of my son alone in his hospital bed to the confessions he had made through weakened breaths, to the overheard conversations of the nurses that revealed how his wife had abandoned him after draining his accounts and shifting the burden of debt entirely onto his shoulders. I spoke without pause, my words spilling out with the urgency of a man who knew time was running short. And when I finally stopped, when my voice broke beneath the weight of everything, he leaned back and studied me with eyes that carried not pity but respect. He told me that what had been done to my son was not only cruel but potentially criminal, that signatures obtained under duress could be challenged, that assets stolen could be traced, and that those who sought to abandon responsibility could often be held accountable if one was willing to follow the trail with persistence. He advised me to hire a private investigator, someone who could track her steps, uncover where she had gone, who she was with, and what she was doing with the money she had taken, and he promised me that if I brought him evidence, he would craft a case so strong that not even her arrogance could dismantle it. His words steadied me, for they transformed my grief into strategy, my anger into direction, and I felt in that moment that I was no longer alone in this fight, that I had allies who would help me protect my son not only with presence, but with justice. I signed papers, authorized inquiries, and placed my trust in him, knowing that while I could not undo the suffering my son had endured, I could ensure that his suffering was not in vain. As I left his office, the sun had begun to climb high in the sky, its light sharper than when I entered, and I felt a renewed strength in my step, because counsel had given me clarity, and clarity had given me power. I returned to the hospital with documents tucked safely in my bag, and as I walked through the corridors back to his room, I told myself that every step I now took was not just as a father, but as a guardian of truth. A man determined to show his son that even in betrayal there can be justice, even in weakness there can be strength, and even in silence there can be resolve. Seeking counsel had not lessened the ache in my chest, but it had given me the tools to carry that ache forward into action, and I promised myself that I would follow every lead, sign every paper, and fight every battle necessary until the truth was uncovered, and those who had abandoned him were forced to face the weight of their choices. The days that followed were filled with waiting by my son's bedside and quiet meetings with the investigator my lawyer had recommended, a man whose calm demeanor and sharp eyes told me he had seen betrayal in many forms before. And though I did not know what he would uncover, I knew in my heart that the truth would be far darker than I imagined. Each evening he would call or meet me in hushed corners of the hospital cafeteria, laying out pieces of information like fragments of a puzzle, and with every detail the picture of my son's wife became clearer, a picture painted not with love or loyalty, but with greed and deceit. The investigator traced her movements after she left the hospital, discovering that she had emptied joint accounts into her own name, leaving my son with nothing but debt. And within days, she had moved into an upscale apartment in another part of the city, far from the hospital where her husband lay fighting for his life. It did not end there, for photographs revealed her dining in expensive restaurants, her laughter captured on the arm of another man whose name I did not yet know, and receipts showed lavish purchases that mocked the sacrifices my son had made to provide for her. Each revelation burned in me like fire, not because I was surprised, but because I had hoped, despite everything, that perhaps there was some misunderstanding, some reason that could soften the cruelty, but the evidence allowed no such illusions. She had not only abandoned him in his time of need, she had built a new life with his money while he struggled to breathe in a sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and sorrow. The investigator handed me copies of the documents, proof of transfers, rental agreements, photographs, and I stared at them with trembling hands, the weight of betrayal pressing harder with each page. I thought of my son lying in that bed, too weak to know the full extent of her betrayal, still whispering her name in moments of confusion, and I felt both rage and sorrow swell in me, a storm that demanded release. Yet beneath that storm was also clarity, because the discovery meant I no longer carried suspicions or whispers. I carried proof that could not be denied, proof that could be laid before her and everyone else she had fooled. I sat with the documents late into the night, the hum of hospital machines drifting from down the hall, and I promised myself that when the time came I would not confront her with anger alone, but with evidence that stripped her of every excuse, every lie, every mask she had worn. The discovery gave me strength because it transformed grief into a weapon, sorrow into resolve, and I knew that what had been hidden in shadows would soon be brought into the light. I looked at my son as he slept fitfully, his body fragile but his spirit still holding on, and I whispered to him that I had found the truth, that I would carry it for him until he was strong enough to face it himself, and that together we would make sure that those who betrayed him would answer for what they had done. The discovery was painful, but it was also the first step toward justice, and as I folded the documents carefully and tucked them away, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The calm of a man who knows the path ahead will be hard, but necessary. The calm of a father who refuses to let betrayal be the final chapter of his son's story. When the investigator placed the last piece of evidence in my hands, and I saw the full scope of her betrayal, I knew the time had come to act, but I also knew that acting in anger would only give her room to twist the truth. So I began to craft a confrontation plan as carefully as I had once built a life for my son, deliberate and steady, with every step designed to expose her without question. I spent long nights sitting in the hospital room beside my son, his shallow breaths and the hum of machines my constant companions. And while I held his hand, I laid out in my mind the way this would unfold. I would not go to her apartment screaming accusations, for that would allow her to paint me as bitter or unstable. I would not corner her alone, for she would deny everything and slither back into the shadows of her deceit. No, the confrontation had to happen where her arrogance would be met with the undeniable weight of truth, in a place where she could not dismiss me, in a place where my son could hear the truth for himself, and where others could witness the mask being torn away. The hospital became the stage in my plan, for I knew she would eventually return not out of love, but out of greed, expecting to demand insurance money or to check on what she believed she still controlled, and when she did, I would be ready. I worked closely with my lawyer, ensuring the documents the investigator had uncovered were not only organized, but presented in a way that could silence even her sharpest excuses. Bank statements, photographs, signed transfers, rental agreements, receipts for dinners and gifts bought for another man, each piece of evidence was placed into a folder that would be handed to her at the moment of truth. My lawyer agreed to stand by my side, ready to explain each document with calm authority, and the investigator would be present as well, his testimony carrying the weight of an unbiased professional. I arranged with the hospital staff that when she arrived, they would allow her into the room, that no scene would be caused until she stood before my son, and only then would the truth be revealed. I wanted her to see the look in his eyes. When the evidence was placed before her, I wanted her to feel the collapse of her carefully woven lies, not in private where she could retreat into denial, but in the very space where her absence had spoken louder than words. As I rehearsed the plan in my mind, I felt the old anger threatening to rise, but I forced myself to breathe deeply and remember that this was not about shouting. This was about dignity. This was about making sure the truth stood unshaken in the light. Each night as I sat in the dim glow of the hospital room, I would whisper to my son that soon the truth would come, that soon he would see that his father had not abandoned him, that soon he would know that love had not left him completely. My confrontation plan was not just for me, it was for him. It was to show him that though the woman he trusted had betrayed him, there was still one person who would fight with everything he had left. When the plan was finally complete, when every detail was prepared, I felt a calm settle over me that I had not known since the day I first walked into that hospital room. I was no longer just a father grieving. I was a father ready to act, ready to stand, ready to reclaim dignity for both myself and my son. And though she believed she had silenced us with betrayal, she would soon learn that truth, once revealed, is louder than any lie. The day of the confrontation arrived sooner than I expected, for word reached me from the nurses that she had called ahead to say she would be stopping by to check on my son. And I knew instantly this was not a visit born of love, but of calculation, because she had learned of the insurance policies he carried, and she assumed his condition made him too weak to question her presence. I sat quietly by his bed as the hours passed, my lawyer and the investigator arriving discreetly to take their places nearby, and the air in the room felt heavier than ever, thick with the tension of what was about to unfold. My son stirred weakly, his eyes fluttering open for moments at a time, and I leaned down to whisper that he was not alone, that he would see the truth with his own eyes. And though he could not speak more than a few faint words, the faint squeeze of his fingers around mine told me he understood. When the door finally opened and she walked in, her heels clicking against the tile, her perfume too sharp for the sterile air of the hospital, I felt my chest tighten, not with fear but with a steady resolve. For here stood the woman who had abandoned my son, and she entered as though nothing had happened. Her voice sickly sweet as she asked how he was doing, her eyes darting quickly to the machines before turning toward me with a forced smile. She did not expect to see me there, and certainly not the two men seated quietly behind me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, a tiny crack in the mask she had worn so confidently. My lawyer rose calmly and introduced himself, handing her the folder we had prepared, and as she opened it, her smile faltered, her eyes scanning the pages, the photographs, the bank records, the rental agreements, each one stripping away her lies layer by layer. She stammered at first, insisting there must be some mistake, but the investigator stepped forward, his voice steady as he explained how each piece of evidence had been gathered, every step documented, every receipt tied directly to her actions. My son's eyes were open now, weak but alert, watching her as tears pooled in the corners. And for the first time she could not look at him, her gaze dropping to the floor as the silence pressed in. I felt anger rising in me, but I kept my voice calm as I told her that the days of betrayal in the shadows were over, that the truth had been laid bare, and that she could no longer hide behind excuses or disappear into the night. She tried to protest, to say she had done what she had to, but her words were brittle, breaking under the weight of the documents spread across the bed table, and the nurses, who had quietly gathered near the doorway, shook their heads, their expressions cold with judgment. My lawyer explained to her the legal consequences of her actions, the financial responsibilities she could not escape, and as each word fell, her shoulders sank lower, her confidence unraveling before the eyes of those she had thought too weak to oppose her. My son's lips moved then, his voice faint but clear enough to reach her, and he whispered a single word that cut deeper than any accusation. He said, "Why?" That one word shattered whatever defenses she had left, and though she opened her mouth to reply, no explanation came, only silence. I reached out and placed my hand gently on my son's shoulder, telling him that the truth was now his, that he no longer had to wonder, that he no longer had to carry the burden of unanswered questions. And as I looked back at her, I saw the collapse of her arrogance, the unraveling of the mask she had worn for so long. The hospital confrontation was not loud or violent. It was quiet, steady, undeniable, and in that stillness, justice finally began to take shape, not in vengeance, but in truth, the kind of truth that cannot be silenced once it has been spoken. As the evidence lay spread out before her and the silence in the hospital room grew heavier with every breath my son took, I watched the collapse of a woman who had once carried herself with an arrogance so thick it could drown a room, and now, under the weight of truth, that arrogance crumbled piece by piece, until she stood revealed, not as the loving wife she pretended to be, but as the betrayer she truly was. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages my lawyer had given her, her eyes darting frantically from one document to the next, each one hammering against the fragile defenses she tried to cling to. She muttered excuses at first, her voice low and frantic, claiming she had been overwhelmed, claiming she had no choice, claiming that circumstances had forced her hand, but each word rang hollow, because the photograph showed her smiling in restaurants. The bank record showed transfers timed with her disappearance. The rental agreements bore her signature, and the receipts told the story of a life of luxury built on the suffering of the man lying weak in the hospital bed before her. My son's gaze never left her, his eyes dim with exhaustion but sharp with recognition, and when she tried to reach for his hand, he turned his face away, and that small gesture broke her more completely than any evidence could. The collapse was not sudden, it was slow, like a tower crumbling stone by stone, her posture sagging, her voice faltering, her eyes welling with tears that for once did not feel manipulative, but filled with the realization that she had been exposed beyond repair. The nurses who had gathered lingered in the doorway, their arms crossed, their expressions cold, and even their silent presence pressed down on her, stripping away the last shred of her pride. She sank into the chair by the bed, her shoulders shaking, whispering apologies that carried no weight, apologies that my son could not accept because they came too late, spoken only when the truth had left her no room to hide. I stood there watching her collapse, and I felt no triumph in her tears, only a strange stillness, because the justice unfolding was not about shouting or gloating, it was about truth, finally piercing through years of deception. My lawyer reminded her calmly that legal consequences were already in motion, that her actions carried weight in the eyes of the law, and the investigator confirmed that every step she had taken was documented, leaving her no path of denial. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly now, and the sound was a pitiful echo of the arrogance she once wielded, a sound that revealed the hollowness of her foundation. My son closed his eyes, his hand tightening faintly in mine, and though he was too weak to speak, I knew what he felt in that moment, the mixture of pain and relief, the anguish of betrayal, but also the clarity of finally seeing her for who she was. Her collapse was not only hers, it was ours too, for it marked the end of illusions, the end of excuses, the end of silence. And though the room remained quiet save for her broken sobs and the steady beeping of the monitors, it carried the weight of finality, a chapter closing before our eyes. I looked at her one last time, and I saw not the woman who had charmed my son, not the wife she had pretended to be, but a person stripped bare of pretense, and I knew that no amount of tears or apologies could rebuild what she had destroyed. Her collapse was complete, and though I felt no joy in watching it, I felt something more important, a sense of vindication, a sense that truth, though often delayed, had finally claimed its place, and that the bond between father and son, though scarred, would now have the chance to heal in the light of honesty. As the silence settled after her sobs filled the hospital room, I turned my gaze back to my son, and though his body was frail and his breathing shallow, I could see in his eyes a sharpness I had not seen in years, the clarity of a man who was finally awakening to the truth that had been hidden from him, and in that moment I witnessed his realization unfold before me. He stared at the folder of evidence that lay open on the table, the bank records, the photographs, the receipts, each one a nail in the coffin of the illusions he had carried. And I could see the pain in his eyes as he traced the pieces of proof that told him his wife had not only abandoned him, but had done so deliberately, leaving him to suffer while she lived in comfort. His lips moved faintly, as if forming questions he no longer needed to ask, because the answers were already there in black and white, and I leaned closer to hear the whisper of his voice as he murmured that he should have listened, that he had been blind to the truth, that he had pushed me away when I tried to warn him. My heart ached at his words, not because I needed the satisfaction of being right, but because I could see the burden of guilt settling on him, and I squeezed his hand gently and told him that none of this was his fault, that love often blinds us, that trust is not weakness, and that the betrayal he had endured revealed nothing about his worth and everything about hers. His eyes filled with tears then, tears not only of grief but of clarity. And he turned his head away from the woman crumpled in the chair, unable to look at her any longer. And that single act told me that the spell had finally broken, that the love he once carried for her had been replaced by the painful but necessary truth of who she truly was. I saw in him the realization that the distance between us, the silence that had grown over the years, had not been entirely his choice, but the result of her influence, her subtle dismissals, her cold control. And though regret clouded his face, I told him softly that it was not too late, that we still had time, that bonds strained by deceit can still heal when rebuilt on truth. He whispered again, his voice fragile but determined, saying that he was sorry for not believing me, sorry for letting her drive a wedge between us, sorry for every moment of silence that now felt wasted. And though each apology broke my heart, I also felt them mend something inside me, because his realization was not only about her betrayal, but about the love that had always bound us, a love that even years of distance could not erase. The machines beeped steadily as I leaned closer and told him that he had nothing to apologize for, that I had never stopped loving him, never stopped waiting for the moment when he would see clearly, and that what mattered now was not the years we had lost, but the time we still had to reclaim together. His grip on my hand tightened, faint but present, and in his eyes I saw a new resolve, the faint glow of determination that even in weakness he would fight, not just against the illness in his body, but against the despair that had nearly broken him. The realization had changed him, stripped away the illusions, and though it left him raw with pain, it also left him free, free from lies, free from manipulation, free to finally rebuild, not as a man deceived, but as a man who understood the truth. Watching him in that moment, I felt the weight of years lift, because I knew that even in his weakness he had found strength, and that together we could face what lay ahead, not as father and son divided by silence, but as father and son united once more in the light of truth. In the quiet days that followed the confrontation, I often found myself sitting by my son's bedside, not speaking, just listening to the hum of the machines and watching the slow rhythm of his breathing. And in that silence, I had time to reflect on everything that had unfolded, the journey that had carried me from arriving unannounced at his home to discovering him alone in a hospital bed, from hearing his broken confession to confronting the woman who betrayed him, and the weight of those reflections filled me with both sorrow and peace, because though the pain of what he endured was still fresh, the strength of truth had begun to heal what had once seemed lost. I thought back to the sacrifices of my younger years, the nights when I worked until my body ached just to keep food on the table and give him opportunities I never had. And I asked myself if those sacrifices had been in vain. But as I looked at him lying there, fragile yet no longer deceived, I realized they had not, for every sacrifice had carried him to this point. And though he had stumbled into betrayal, he was still alive, still fighting, still my son. I reflected on the distance that had grown between us, the years of silence when I told myself that patience was love. And though regret twisted in my chest, I also understood now that love cannot always remain silent, that sometimes it must speak even when it risks rejection, and I promised myself that I would never again allow fear of losing him to keep me from speaking truth. I thought of his wife's collapse under the weight of evidence, the arrogance that had crumbled into tears. And though I felt no joy in her downfall, I did feel a sense of justice, because betrayal should never go unanswered. And I knew her actions had been exposed not by vengeance, but by truth. The kind of truth that can no longer be denied once it stands in the open. Reflection carried me through memories of my son's realization too. The way his eyes cleared as he finally saw who she was. The way his weak voice whispered apologies. And though those apologies broke me, I also felt them mend the bond that had frayed for too long. I told myself that reflection is not about regret alone, but about learning, about taking the weight of mistakes and turning them into lessons. And in those long hours by his side, I learned that patience without boundaries can invite betrayal, that sacrifice without recognition can be taken for granted, and that love, to survive, must carry both forgiveness and firmness. I looked out the hospital window one evening, the sun dipping low over the horizon, and I felt my wife's presence in that moment, her memory reminding me that family is not measured by perfection but by endurance, and I knew she would have been proud that I stood by our son when no one else did. Reflection also gave me peace, because I saw clearly that though the years had been marked by hardship and silence, they had also been marked by devotion, and devotion does not disappear simply because it is overlooked for a time. It endures until the truth brings it back into the light. I whispered to myself that I had not failed him, not truly, because I was here now, stronger than I had been in years, ready to protect him in ways I once thought were no longer needed. And as I held his hand, I felt a calm certainty that whatever came next, we would face it together. Reflection gave me clarity. Clarity that love is not weakness, that truth is not cruelty, and that dignity is not found in silence, but in the courage to act when it matters most. And with that clarity, I felt the weight of sorrow lighten, replaced by the strength of knowing that our bond had survived the storm. Vindication came not with loud declarations or triumphant gestures, but with the quiet certainty that the truth had finally settled where it belonged. And as I sat beside my son in those days after the confrontation, I felt a peace growing in me that had been absent for many years, a peace that came from knowing that I had acted when it mattered, that I had stood when it would have been easier to stay silent, and that my son, though weakened by betrayal and illness, now understood not only the truth of those who abandoned him, but the strength of the Father who never would. The hospital room that had once felt heavy with despair began to carry a different kind of weight, the weight of healing, both physical and emotional, because though his body was still frail, his spirit had shifted, and I could see it in the way his eyes met mine. No longer clouded with shame or confusion, but clearer, steadier, carrying the recognition of a bond renewed. The woman who had betrayed him was gone, stripped of her power, her mask collapsed, her actions exposed to more than just us. For the evidence we had gathered had been placed into the proper hands, ensuring that she could not simply slip into the shadows and continue her life unchallenged. And though I did not seek revenge, I did seek accountability. And in that accountability I found vindication. I thought back to the years of distance, the silence I endured, the times I wondered if he had forgotten the sacrifices of his childhood, and I realized that none of those doubts mattered anymore because the truth had risen, and the bond between us had been reclaimed in the crucible of hardship. Vindication was not about watching her collapse. It was about watching my son begin to heal, about hearing his weak voice whisper gratitude where once there had been silence, about knowing that in his heart he now carried the understanding that no matter the distance, no matter the mistakes, his father's love had never left him. I felt vindication, too, in the way the nurses now looked at us, their eyes soft with respect rather than pity, because they had seen the truth unfold. They had witnessed the collapse of arrogance and the endurance of love. And in their quiet nods, I felt the acknowledgement that dignity had been restored. At night, when I closed my eyes in that stiff hospital chair, I no longer felt the ache of uncertainty. I felt the calm of a man who had done what needed to be done, who had honored both his son and the memory of his wife by protecting what was sacred. Vindication is not always loud. Sometimes it is found in the smallest of moments, like when my son squeezed my hand with more strength than before, or when he whispered that he was proud of me, words I had not expected, but which carried more power than any victory. I looked at him and saw not only the frail patient fighting for recovery, but the boy I once held, the man I had always believed in, and I told myself that whatever years remained for me would be spent ensuring he never faced such darkness again. Vindication came in knowing that though betrayal had scarred him, it had not destroyed him, and though silence had separated us, it had not broken us, and though cruelty had threatened to erase his dignity, love and truth had restored it. As I walked the corridor one evening and looked out at the setting sun, I felt the warmth of its light and thought of my wife, imagining her smile, knowing she would have been proud that I had fought not with anger but with truth, and that I had reclaimed not only our son's dignity but my own. Vindication was mine, quiet but absolute, and as I returned to his bedside, I felt the strength of a father who had endured, who had acted, and who had ensured that love and truth would have the final word. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left